My talk is going to be on Lacan. I have to warn you in advance that I am not a clinician, a practitioner, nor am I even a specialist of psychoanalysis or Lacan. So what I'm going to say might seem very basic to you. Let me just say a few words about the perspective from which I'm going to approach Lacan, and that is a genealogical one. And let me also say a few words about the specific problem that I'm concerned with. Now, what does it mean genealogical in this instance, and specifically sort of Foucauldian? I need to be brief, so let me just highlight the following two distinctive features. Genealogy, first of all, is concerned with, as you know, extracting the historical conditions under which a particular object, a particular discourse, and the practice and institutions to which it's attached comes into being, and tracing its specific history. In that respect, genealogy isn't concerned with evaluating, disputing, or replacing the discourse in question, which is a discourse of truth, a discourse that claims to reveal the truth of its object. So it's not in the business of replacing or disputing that discourse with another discourse of the same kind. Its problem then is not to know whether and the extent to which the discourse in question, in this instance that of Lacan, is true, but it is interested in the status of truth in the discourse in question. And I'll return to the question of truth in the psychoanalytic discourse later on. As for the general problematic within which I'm going to situate Lacan's discourse, let me just say this. It is the problematic of desire, unsurprisingly perhaps. It is concerned with asking how and when desire became a problem, and how the Western subject came to understand and recognize him or herself as a subject of desire. It is concerned then with desire as a process of subjectivation. Now, in a lecture at Berkeley in 1983, Foucault claimed that the Western civilization is probably the civilization of desire. By that, he meant the civilization that managed to elevate desire to the level of a technique or technology of the self, that is, of a dispositif, to use his own vocabulary. I would say a series of dispositifs through which subjects governed themselves. I'm interested in the dispositif, or what we could call the regimes of desire that govern us today. That is, in understanding how desire is organized, delineated, framed today, and what regimes of desire we are discouraged or forgotten. Now, Foucault himself traces the origins of what he calls the man of desire, and he is very much male, back to late Stoicism and early Christianity, and tries to convince us that up until then, the problem of love, of erotic and sexual relationship was couched in terms not of desire, or to use the Greek term epithemia, but of pleasure, aphrodisia. The question was not which desires are acceptable and which aren't, to what extent should I give way to my desires, and to what extent should I seek to dominate or neutralize them, but rather, what pleasures should I seek, with whom, when, for how long, under what circumstances, etc. Now, personally, I'm not interested, as I was suggesting a moment ago, in identifying the regimes of desire. Sorry, I'm more interested in identifying the regimes of desire under which we live today and in tracing their emergence. I'm going to mention them and say a few things about them because I want to claim that they all find their way into Lacan's thought and into that particular text of his that I will be looking at in some detail, called Theoretical Introductions to the Functions of Psychoanalysis and Criminology, which dates from 1950, and all of the extracts that you have on the handout come from that particular text, which isn't even referenced in the handout. So, Theoretical Introductions to the Functions of Psychoanalysis in Criminology. What I can't do, given the time constraints, is give an argument or demonstration of how those different regimes of desire came into being. I will have to proceed then somewhat axiomatically. It seems to me that there are at least three such regimes which intersect and overlap in what we could call the contemporary subject of desire, but without amounting to anything like a harmonious synthesis or a unified form of subjectivity. There is, first of all, and before the emergence of the discourse of sexuality itself, or the sensu sexualis, in the 1840s, the regime of political economy and the space of the market, which emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In that context, it is striking to see that after centuries of an essentially Christian ethos, for which desires needed indeed to be dominated, regulated, and subordinated to the ideal of salvation, that is to say, to a pastoral technology of the soul, desires and the very idea of the human as an essentially and irreducibly desiring creature are rehabilitated. Rehabilitated and at the same time reinterpreted as interest or self-interest and under the paradigm of utility. Under what Foucault calls liberal governmentality, and even more so under neoliberalism, individual desires as oriented towards one's own interests are seen as indispensable mechanisms of the market, which is itself seen as the space in which those desires can express and combine themselves freely. This is how, I could give you many examples, the semantic of desire and the problematic of freedom came to be, if not entirely identified, at least closely associated. The second regime is the following. Then, and very much against the backdrop of the emergence of this new form of governmentality through economic self-interest, there is the discourse, the clinical discourse of sexuality, which, as you all know, emerged in the 1840s and centered on the concept of instinct. To be more specific, on the concept of a natural sexual instinct, genital, procreative, and heterosexual, with respect to which it became possible to identify a potentially infinite number of perversions or sexual pathologies, as the various versions of the DSM continue to demonstrate. Now, this analytic and typology of sexuality was from the start normative. That is to say, it took place within this key distinction between the normal and the pathological. It was also, in many ways, repressive and disciplinary. In fact, I would argue that its connection with the penal system was absolutely central and that it was able to emerge and develop only as a rationality aimed at making sense of certain acts or violations of the law that simply couldn't fall under the liberal rationality of interest and motive, the penal liberal rationality of interest and motive. It would be interesting in that context to have a discussion about Freud and about the manner in which, from within the analytic of sexuality, a shift begins to take place from a normative understanding of the sexual instinct and a normalizing of sexual life to a polymorphously, or to the recognition of a polymorphously perverse interpretation of the sexual drives, and thus a far less disciplinary attitude towards sexuality. But if I choose to focus on Lacan instead, it's because he occupies, it seems to me, a singular position in relation to both the economic system of desire as interest and the clinical, or if you will, normal and pathological regime of desire as instinct and even drive. I'm interested in Lacan then because it seems to me that his conception and practice of psychoanalysis marks, if you will, a limit internal to or a point of inflection or bifurcation within the analytic of sexuality. In fact, it seems to me that while still related to sexuality as a problem, there is no question about it, it signals the possibility of a way out and thus the recognition of another regime of desire, one that it believes to be more fundamental. And that, I believe, he does by shifting desire away from the normative, within which it was inscribed within the rationality of psychiatry, and towards the law. And psychoanalysis, therefore, away from a clinic and towards something like a therapeutic ethics. Specifically, my thesis, insofar as I have one, is that Lacan carries out the transition or mediation in question by shifting the clinical emphasis from the normative discourse of sexual instincts and perversions, which he judges to be rooted in a problematic naturalism and biologism, to the symbolic order of prohibition, transgression, and guilt, rooted in a structural and founding relation to the law. And thus, at the same time, by reviving a connection that is ancient, if not archaic, in every sense of the word. In other words, he loosens the grip of the normative and naturalism on desire, but only to tie the latter to what I would call its legislative or symbolic and archaic regime. Now, all of this, I think, comes across quite clearly in a text by Lacan that, as far as I know, isn't discussed much, if at all. Well, the text in question is the one I was mentioning, Theoretical Introduction to the Functions of Psychoanalysis in Criminology. And it was delivered to the 13th Conference of Francophone Psychoanalysts in May of 1950, and written with Michel Sénac, who ended up running against Lacan as head of the French Society of Psychoanalysis in 1953, and losing by 1 vote only. Sénac was a doctor, a psychiatrist, but also, and importantly, a forensic expert. This article is of special interest, I think, because it attempts to define the specificity of the contribution of psychoanalysis to the link that is established in the 19th century between psychiatry, criminology, and the penal institution. As such, it raises the question of the place of psychoanalysis in the context of the strong connection, which I can't explore here, between the penal rationality of liberal governmentality and the sentia sexualis. The article begins by situating psychoanalysis within the field of the human sciences. Psychoanalysis, Lacan claims elsewhere, is the science of desire. Insofar as it is scientific, it would seem that, like criminology, which seeks the truth of the crime and of the criminal, psychoanalysis partakes of the same relation to truth. It would seem that by identifying psychoanalysis as the science of desire, Lacan is seeking to define its place within the history and morphology of Western thought. After all, the Western morphology of knowledge, to use Foucault's expression, is precisely one that defines itself as a system of truth, in which truth is opposed to falsehood and understands science as the innate desire for truth. Is this the desire that Lacan has in mind when he speaks of psychoanalysis as the science of desire? Now, we could easily be forgiven for believing that it is, and for seeing psychoanalysis as belonging to the history of what Foucault calls veridiction. And yet, from a psychoanalytic point of view, and contrary to what Aristotle claims, and Oedipus assumes, no desire for truth will ever exhaust the truth of desire. This is because desire unfolds beyond truth, beyond, that is, any correct proposition which is mere adequation or homology. The truth of desire is precisely the truth that withdraws in what it says, conceals itself in what it utters. It is the truth of the id that dresses up as error. The unconscious lies, Lacan writes, and this lie is its way of telling the truth. This is something he says in Seminar 7. As such, the truth of desire is one that cannot be extracted or discovered simply as a result of a goodwill to truth. Psychoanalysis requires its own truth, techniques and procedures, its own system of truth. Now, we could equally be forgiven for believing that the technique of psychoanalysis isn't altogether different from the technique of confession as it is used in judicial affairs to establish the guilt and responsibility of criminals. Isn't the talking cure a form of aliturgy, that is to say, a therapy through truth-telling? And psychoanalysis, as himself suggests, a form of pastoral care. But this similarity, I would argue, is only superficial. Lacan and Sénac, in their article, want to distinguish psychoanalysis and its specific relation to truth from the strong historical connection which they believe binds the sense of truth as ordeal and sworn oath in religious societies, the technique of confession in Christianity, and the practice of torture, for a very disciplinary practice. The latter are, they claim, the two faces of European humanism. A humanism to which we'll see Lacan opposes another humanism rooted in a different sense of truth, itself irreducible to any positivism or naturalism. The manner in which truth emerges in the context of analysis is entirely different from and cannot amount to anything like a confession, for the simple reason that it is primarily negative. It takes place through omissions, slips of the tongue, errors, actions that contradict our will, and denials. The parole, the speech that analysis receives and listens to, is different from and irreducible to language, langage. If by language we mean the mere communication of information, this difference comes from the fact that to speak is always to speak to someone and thus to relate to another. But where otherness is at stake, and when is it not, the message is always coded. In speech, there is always the question of knowing who or what is speaking and to whom. Such is the reason why the speech of the analysant is not equivalent to a confession, and why its relation to truth is more that of the witness. It is a testimony, Lacan says, a bearing witness, in which something is said and at the same time concealed. What we normally call disinterested communication, on which the ideal of human knowledge and science, as we understand it itself, is premised, Lacan says, is ultimately only failed testimony. That is, something on which everybody is agreed. But what reaches and comes across in speech is essentially different. It is a desire, or better said still, desire itself. In that sense, the truth of analysis is merely opposed to falsehood, and the speech or parole of the analysant isn't reducible to being truthful about oneself. Far from signalling the truth content of a proposition and being a matter of homology, far even from saying something about oneself, it is first and foremost an address through which the ego overcomes its own imaginary identification and recognizes the reality of otherness itself. The second section of the article begins by affirming what seems to be all too obvious, namely that there is no society without laws and prohibitions. In fact, the obviousness of this claim was established by Lévi-Strauss in the Elementary Structures of Kinship, published the year before the talk. Prohibitions, and the prohibition of incest in particular, he claimed, define the very transition from nature to culture and constitutes the irreducible ground on which any society is erected. Freud arrives at the same conclusion in Totem and Taboo. The origin of the universal law and of sociality itself is to be found in the primordial crime of parricide and incest. This means that in committing the crime, the law with a capital L itself does not disappear. On the contrary, not only does the murder of the father fail to bring about the jouissance of the mother that his presence was supposed to prohibit, it actually reinforces the prohibition itself, in that it is now associated with the guilt of the murder and is thus internalized as the moral law. This is the pivotal moment and the key connection that penology and psychiatry fail on their terms to acknowledge. Behind every law, there is the law with a capital L, and the ultimately impossible jouissance of transgression. This is what allows Lacan and Sénac to claim that their experience of psychopathology has brought them, they say, to the very jointure between nature and culture. The crimes that from the very beginning caught Lacan's imagination, crimes of paranoid jealousy and narcissistic identification, reveal a crisis in that jointure itself. To use their own terms, a blind and tyrannical agency that is the direct antinomy of the Kantian ideal of pure duty. They reveal a crisis in the social and moral order, and therein lies the essential difference with the liberal rationality of crime and punishment and the response of psychiatry. They reveal a crisis in the social and moral order that lies not in the transgression of a particular law of the land, attributable to a dysfunction or perversion of a natural instinct, but in transgression itself, that is, in the desire to affirm one's desire against the law. To be sure, crimes are transgressions of the law and are punished in various ways. The question of who exactly is responsible, the question of punishment, varies throughout history and according to geographies. Today, we tend to attribute responsibility to individuals, whereas many primitive societies, as they say, view transgressions of the law as a collective issue requiring a collective solution. Now, it's precisely on this question of responsibility Lacan and Sénac claim that psychoanalysis can be of precious use. For it is able to shed light on the nature of what, following the semantics of 19th and early 20th century psychiatry and law, but only to overturn it, Lacan calls a, and I quote, force that the subject cannot resist, and leaves him or her to commit a heinous crime. But it's able to do that precisely insofar as it constitutes a challenge to the liberal utilitarian order, greater even than the challenge posed by the idea of the natural sexual instinct, of which I would claim that it is only the other face of liberalism. Let me read the first quotation on the handout. Phrenologists, sure of themselves and even implacable, as soon as a utilitarian motivation appeared, so much so that English practice at that time considered misdemeanors, even if they only involved petty theft that occasioned homicide to be equivalent to the premeditation that defines first-degree murder, hesitated when faced with crimes in which instinct surface, whose nature escaped the utilitarian register within which someone like Bentham developed his ideas. Now, I would claim that this utilitarian framework of the penal system is one under which we still live today. The hesitation, I would argue, is precisely what gave rise to psychiatry's theory of criminal or perverse instincts, and to its focus on sexual instincts in particular. But, as the title of section 5 of Lacan's article suggests, there is no such thing as criminal instincts. No such thing that is as animal or aggressive instincts that human reason would tame, or for that matter, perversions of normal and good natural instincts. In fact, the cruelty and aggressiveness in question are themselves distinctly human. So human, in fact, that they define human sociality as such, and as Balthazar Gracian recognized in his Criticon, that the natural predators and wild beasts that roam the earth would recoil in horror if they could witness them. The obstacles on which the rationality of utility stumbles, then, and which continues to define our situation today, Lacan argues further in Seminar 7, is that a desire insofar as it escapes or exceeds the boundaries of the good and the pleasurable and embraces, as he calls it in that seminar at least, evil. As long as what's at stake is the good, Lacan claims, there is no problem, and the principle of utility can apply. But that principle cannot, what that principle cannot account for is the problem, indeed the very disturbing reality of, and I quote, the evil that I desire and that my neighbor desires. The evil that consists in the enjoyment of my neighbor, la jouissance de mon prochain. As a result, both the psychiatric and utilitarian approaches to crime and punishment, which belong together, prove to be, on their terms, Lacan and Sénac's terms, wholly inadequate. In fact, they cover up precisely the truth of the crime itself, and the punishment is, as a result, inevitably inappropriate. Second quotation on the handout, which I'm going to read out quite quickly. A civilization whose ideals are ever more utilitarian, since it is caught up in the accelerated movement of production, can no longer understand anything about the expiatory signification of punishment. While it may consider punishment useful as a warning to others, it tends to assimilate it into its correctional goal. And that is indeed the heart of the penal liberal rationality, which is one, first and foremost, motivated by the idea of the motive, and therefore also a punishment as essentially useful and efficient. And this goal imperceptibly changes objects. The ideals of humanism dissolve into the utilitarianism of the group. And since the group that lays down the law is, for social reasons, not at all sure that the foundations of its power are just, it relies on a humanitarianism in which are expressed both the revolt of the exploited and the guilty conscience of the exploiters, to whom the notion of punishment has become equally unbearable. An ideological antinomy reflects here as elsewhere a social malaise. It is now seeking the solution to that malaise in a scientific approach to the problem. That is, in a psychiatric analysis of the criminal, to which, in the final analysis of all the measures for preventing crime and guarding against recidivism, what can be called a sanitary conception of penology must be related. The current rationality of punishment, then, Lacan and Sénac argue in here predominantly Marxist terms, remains caught up in the productivist and efficiency-based model of liberal governmentality, in the rationality of interest and motive, and is as such incapable of grasping the essentially symbolic or expiatory, as they say, value of punishment. To this day, punishment tends to be considered from the point of view of utility and efficiency and as a merely corrective or correctional measure. By contrast, psychoanalysis is able to reveal the complex dynamic of desire that lies behind the transgression, not only of the law in question, but of normal human behavior. The unconscious truth it is able to uncover is that of a symbolic order based on a symbolic punitive crime, that of the father, a symbolic punitive feeling, that of guilt, and a symbolic punitive prohibition, that of incest. Furthermore, it claims that most crimes can be traced back to that original desire, that the libidinal economy governs the most violent and aggressive impulses and actions of human beings, and thus that the truth of the crime itself is to be found not in a perversion of the natural and specifically sexual instincts, as psychiatry has claimed since the 1840s, but in the symbolic structure of desire. The human, Lacan and Sénac claim in their essay, begins with the symbolic order of the law, that is, with a limit that both inhibits and delimits my desire. This, I believe, signals precisely the shift I've been announcing from the normative to the legislative paradigm, and from sexual desire as a natural instinct to sexual desire as a complex. Furthermore, by introducing the symbolic dimension within criminology, psychoanalysis resists naturalizing the criminal, that is, transforming him or her into an animal or a non-human being, in the way that we still do by talking about sexual predators, for example, or moral monsters, or this discourse that oscillates between animality and monstrosity. They write the following: psychoanalysis simultaneously resolves a dilemma in criminological theory. In unrealizing, that is to say, symbolizing crime, it does not dehumanize the criminal. Moreover, by means of transference, psychoanalysis grants us access to the imaginary world of the criminal, which can open the door to reality, le réel, for him. In that way, psychoanalysis is able to present itself as the genuine face of humanism. It is a clinic, yes, but it is also, and perhaps above all, an ethics and even a politics. As Bo Jacobsen rightly emphasized, I think, Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis is, as he says, a therapy of the socius and a medicine of civilization. Now, it seems to be that, and to return to Foucault, that this trajectory that I've tried to sketch out very, very briefly and schematically is one that Foucault himself recognizes and comments on, albeit obliquely and in passing, towards the end of the first volume of History of Sexuality, in the context of his discussion of modern racism and of state racism in particular, as exemplified by Nazism. But as we know now today, there are many other examples. In those pages, psychoanalysis is given a key, but essentially, I would say, ambiguous position. On the one hand,
Foucault praises psychoanalysis for having resisted the manner in which, starting in the middle of the 19th century, the analytic of sexuality began to overlap and merge with the symbolic of the blood. Now no longer blood in relation to class or alliances, but in relation to the species, and thus facilitating the emergence of scientific racism and eugenics. In a lecture at the Collège de France of February 1975, he says something similar. As a result of its emphasis on the concept of instinct rather than delirium, psychiatry found itself caught between two technologies. That of eugenics, with the problem of heredity, purification of the race, and correction of the system of instincts of human beings, and that of psychoanalysis, which is also, he claimed, a system of correction and normalization to an extent of the instincts, but of a very different kind. The former, he adds in another lecture, led to a general theory of degeneracy and abnormality, and to further technologies aimed not only at curing the abnormal, but also protecting society, the human race, and species from all sorts of dangers. In other words, whilst itself inconceivable outside the emergent and history of biopower, inconceivable, that is, outside the manner in which the life of the human species entered the field of political techniques, psychoanalysis never succumbed to the immunological racism that psychiatry helped forge. Now, we also know that the picture isn't as clear and as straightforward as that. Therein, Foucault writes, lies the political honour of psychoanalysis. Now, what made that resistance possible? The key consequence of the emergence of biopower is the growing importance of the play of norms at the cost of the juridical system of the law. To be more precise, the law and the institutions it gave birth to don't disappear, but function increasingly as a norm, and are increasingly integrated within a continuum of medical, statistical, and economic apparatuses, the functions of which are primarily normative. In that respect, Nazism can be seen as the attempt entirely to subordinate the legal to the normative, that is, to identify the sphere of the political and of right with that of the norm in a biological sense. The final solution and the systematic politics of eugenics, where perhaps the purest and most radical perversion of biopower, that is, the most extreme and in fact delirious attempt to protect life itself, or the vital instincts and organs of the body politic, now no longer a metaphor, but a political reality itself, to protect them from external and internal pathogens, to select those that can maximize the health and chances of survival of the population, now understood as race, and exterminate the others. Nazism, in other words, is the politics of immunology. More recently, the biopolitics of apartheid in South Africa also operated within this immunological paradigm. Now, the political honour of psychoanalysis and the principle of its theoretical and practical opposition to fascism, according to Foucault, consists precisely in having seen in the law with a capital L, and not the norm, the key to understanding desire. The distinction between instincts and drives, in the end, would revolve around the distinction between norms and the law, or between a medical and juridical or symbolic paradigm. The principle of resistance then, and possibly strangely, resided in its ability to organize desire around the order of sovereign, the ancient order of sovereign power. On the other hand, and whilst understandable, especially given the degree of implication of German psychiatry in Nazi Germany, Foucault's comments may seem surprising. In fact, it might even seem incoherent or contradictory, given what he says in the very first pages of the same part of Volume 1 of the History of Sexuality. Everything happens as if, by the time he'd arrived at the end of the volume, he had simply forgotten what he had said at the very beginning. Indeed, Part 4, called the Dispositives of Sexuality, begins with methodological considerations regarding how best to approach the problem of power. It distinguishes between two representations of power, the second of which Foucault recognizes as his own. And he talks about, on the one hand, a classical and common representation, which he calls juridico-discursive, in that it revolves around precisely the law. And to that, he opposes, to this very, in a way, common representation of the law, to the system of opposition between the licit and the illicit, what is permitted and what is forbidden, to this system of prohibition, then, transgression and punishment. Foucault wishes to oppose another image or another idea of what he calls an analytic of power, the very analytic that he sought to expose and criticize throughout his life. Its aim is to reveal the many creative and constantly evolving ways in which power actually works. His conclusion, one that strongly resonates with the core of Deleuze and Guattari's project in Anti-Oedipus, on condition that we replace power with desire, is that we, and I quote, need to rid ourselves of a juridical and negative representation of power, give up trying to think of it in terms of the law, prohibition, freedom, and sovereignty. Now, the reason why I mention Anti-Oedipus is because while subscribing entirely to the project that Foucault lays out in those pages, its target is precisely psychoanalysis as a technology of power that never ceases to plug an essentially productive and positive force, namely desire, into a system of representation, a theatre, as they call it, with the same characters, the same plot and scenes, and the same basic mechanism, namely lack and the Oedipal triangle, repeated time and again and for eternity. In other words, Deleuze and Guattari's main criticism is that psychoanalysis, precisely to the extent that it reorganizes the mechanics of desire around the transcendent pole of the law with a capital L, betrays its own immanence, that is to say, its own productivity. And therein, they conclude, lies precisely the historical and political disgrace of psychoanalysis. So, within the context of a materialist schizoanalysis, what Foucault sees as the political honor of psychoanalysis, they precisely see as the political disgrace of psychoanalysis. And I'll stop here. Thank you.